What's up, guys, and welcome to Will Sports Talk, where I keep you informed on everything college football from now all the way into the end of the season in January. So, a little bit about me, why I wanted to do this before we get started. I'm Owen. I'm 21 years old. I'm in a wheelchair, hence the name Will Sports Talk. The reason I'm in a wheelchair, just to give you a little background, I was actually born with spina bifida, which is the incompletion of the spine at birth. More specifically, myelomeningocele, which is the most severe form of spina bifida that you can have. Spina bifida literally means split spine. And then on top of that, I was born with severe scoliosis and hydrocephalus. So between those three things, that is what led me to being in a wheelchair my entire life, ever since birth. So going into the sports side of things, I've always loved sports, more specifically football. I mean, I've loved the game of football ever since I was real little. I mean, there was not a Saturday, even now, there's not a Saturday or a Thursday that you will not catch me in front of the TV from 11 a.m. to about probably midnight when that last game goes off. I'm in front of that TV 24/7. I'm not moving. And then on top of that, my brother, he's a senior this year, and he just played his last ever football season this year. And he started playing in 4th grade when he started Pee Wee. So I've been watching him and following him ever since he was in 4th grade up until now. So fast forward to 2019. Graduate high school, enroll in college, and my dream was to be a sports broadcaster. So I enrolled in college to be a broadcaster because that's what I wanted to be. Well, time goes on, and truthfully, it starts to take a toll on me mentally. Kind of exhausting, I guess you can say. It just got to the point to where I couldn't do it anymore. So I decided I was going to drop out. So that's what I did. But I figured, why am I going to let that stop me from chasing my dreams, talking about football? So this is where I'm at. So, a little bit on how this is going to work. These first 2 episodes, and after these first 2 episodes, I'm going to kind of rethink on what else I need to do, kind of give y'all more content. But these first 2 episodes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over each team in the SEC and kind of break down their season from last year. Kind of a season recap, I guess you could say. And things leading up to this year for the team. And then kind of their expectation going into next year. And I'm going to break it into divisions. So today I'm going to do the East. And then next week, in my next video, I'm going to do the West. So, like I said, I'm going to do the East. And let's go ahead and get started. And why not start off with the defending national champions, Georgia Bulldogs. Georgia last year, 15-0, SEC champions, back-to-back national champions. Last year won the first national championship in 40 years. And then after that, Georgia lost 15, I believe it was 15 players last year. And then they just repeat, run the table, undefeated, easily look like the most dominant team in college football. After losing 15 players, and you win the national championship. That just shows you how good of a coach and how good of a recruiter Kirby Smart is. And Kirby Smart, he's entering his 8th season, by the way. He's been there for a little bit. But that just shows you how good of a recruiter and coach he is. He's one of the best defensive minds you're going to find in college football. If not the best defensive mind in college football. So, but anyway, won national championship last year. Won it again this year. They played TCU this year and beat TCU 65-7. 65-7. They didn't just beat TCU. They absolutely destroyed TCU. They embarrassed TCU. And Georgia's defense against TCU, I guess dominance. Dominant is the only word you could use to describe Georgia's defense against TCU. It was absolutely unbelievable. And Stetson Bennett, he went off too. It was just an all-around great performance by Georgia against TCU. So, congratulations to Georgia on winning back-to-back national champions. Have a chance to do it a third time. Have a chance to repeat. Which they very could. And I'll get into that in a minute. But, still talking about last year, but just to kind of give you more statistics, Georgia had the top scoring defense in the country last year, and they had the 5th ranked overall defense in the country. See, Georgia's losing 13 players this year. I would say the most important players that they're losing, Stetson Bennett, their quarterback from last year, played tremendous for Georgia last year. Was a Heisman Trophy finalist last year. He's going to be hard to replace for Georgia this year. Then on top of that, you got defensive lineman Jalen Carter. dominant defensive lineman. You got cornerback Kelee Ringo. And Kelee Ringo, for those of you who don't remember, was the player 2 years ago that had the pick 6 to make it Bryce Young's second pick of the national championship against Georgia 2 years ago to beat Alabama 33-18 to win their first national championship in 40 years. That was Kelee Ringo. Then you got linebacker Nolan Smith, real physical linebacker. Then you got tight end Darnell Washington. Absolutely a beast, which, they've got Brock Bowers coming back this year. So, they're not going to technically lose anything at the tight end position. But still, Darnell Washington, the dude stands over 6 foot tall. And he weighs probably over 250, if not real close to 250. So you're losing a big body at tight end. And you're losing a physical player at tight end. He was a good player for Georgia. But like I said, got Brock Bowers returning, so they're not going to lose much there. You've got 13 players returning, including Brock Bowers. Georgia lost their OC this year. He's going to, I believe, it is the Baltimore Ravens to be their OC, Todd Monken. So, Todd Monken is leaving for the Baltimore Ravens. But they did promote Mike Bobo to be their OC. Mike Bobo was an offensive analyst for Georgia, I believe the last two seasons maybe. They promoted him to be their OC, and for those of you who don't remember, Mike Bobo was South Carolina's OC probably 2 or 3 years ago. So they've got him stepping into that OC role. Georgia, they got some transfers through the portal this year. Some big ones, I would say, is Dominic Lovett. He came from Missouri. He's a dominant wide receiver, a big play wide receiver. He was the 6th leading receiver last year at Missouri. And then, on top of that, they got Ra Thomas, wide receiver out of Mississippi State. Again, dynamic wide receiver for Mississippi State. Big-time wide receiver. Them 2 wide receivers are going to give their receiving core a lot of depth. I mean, it's not like they need it, but it's going to give them a lot more depth at the receiver position. Going to help them out. Georgia's also got a quarterback competition this year. Got redshirt junior Carson Beck, redshirt sophomore Brock Vandagriff, and then redshirt freshman Gunnar Stockman. Now, Stockman and Vandagriff didn't see much playing time this year, if at all. I don't think Vandagriff saw the field at all. Stockton may have seen the field a little bit this year. But Carson Beck, he played a little bit in relief of Stetson Bennett. He got, and this might sound, I guess you could say, rude, but he got he got a little garbage time, I guess you could say. He didn't play much, but he got some garbage time. So, got that competition going on. I fully expect Carson Beck to win the job. I mean, just strictly off of experience, if I'm being for real. But I do expect him to win the job. Going into this coming up season, I kind of expect Georgia to do much of the same as last year. I mean, and I'm not fixing to go through and go game by game on their schedule. If you want me to do that for Georgia or any team in general, don't even have to be SEC. Any team in general, just put in the comments who you want me to do, and I will break down schedule game by game on how I think that team's going to do. But like I was saying, going into next year, I expect Georgia to do much of the same. Their schedule, especially non-conference, is very weak. Very weak. And their conference slate is not that strong either. So, and with that being said, that plus the recruits coming in, I mean, I think Georgia's got a top 5 recruiting class coming in. So I will be very surprised if Georgia is not 3-peat. I mean, the hardest game on their schedules next year, is I believe it's at Tennessee, and then at Auburn. That's their 2 hardest games next year. Auburn is in the middle of a rebuild, I guess you could say. Now, Tennessee, they're on the up and up. Tennessee's on the up and up. But with Tennessee and Auburn being their 2 hardest games, I don't see any reason Georgia can't run the table and go undefeated again and win the national championship. I just don't. But moving on to team number 2, and that is the Tennessee Volunteers. So, Tennessee coming off an 11-2 year. Josh Heupel, he's in his 3rd season as head coach at Tennessee. He came from UCF a few years ago, where he had a really good tenure at UCF. A really good tenure. But he's entering his 3rd season at Tennessee. He's coming off big wins this past season. One of the best seasons in Tennessee history, by the way. But coming off big wins this year over LSU, Clemson, And then Alabama. Beating Alabama was a big one because they broke a 15-game losing streak to Alabama. And then Tennessee, they also had some ugly, some not losses. Well, some not so much. It was still ugly, but not so much. Lost to Georgia 27-13. I know that score does not seem quote unquote bad. But if you watch that game, that score does not dictate how that game went. That game was a lot more lopsided than 27-13. It was. It wasn't really a game. That was another game where Georgia's defense just dominated the whole game. And then you had that beatdown by South Carolina, 63-38. 63-38 by South Carolina. By a quarterback who's been up and down all year. I mean, let me put this in this perspective. Tennessee's defense played so bad in this game. At Williams-Brice, every time South Carolina scores, they shoot fireworks. South Carolina scored so much, they run out of fireworks. Literally. If you watch the game, they run out of fireworks. It was that bad. But they had those two losses. But throughout his years at Tennessee, he's actually done pretty well. He's 18-8 as a head coach at Tennessee. At one point, they were ranked as high as number 1. Before that, quote unquote, ugly loss to Georgia, they were number 1. Then Georgia knocked them off. They had the number 1 offense in the country last year. They also had the fastest offense in the country last year with that no-huddle offense. I mean, that offense was hard to stop. Just ask Alabama. Tennessee is losing 7 players to the draft. Most important, I would say, their quarterback, Hendon Hooker. One thing about Hendon Hooker, he may have got injured this past year, but the man got screwed of at least going to New York for the Heisman. Yes, he got injured. So he shouldn't have won the Heisman because he's got less playing time. But the man got screwed of at least going to New York. He did. You can't tell me a quarterback of that caliber and those stats, you gonna keep him out of New York just because he suffered an injury. I don't agree with that. I don't. Hendon Hooker was really good. He was probably the second best quarterback in the SEC this year. I mean, he might have been the first. He has a real argument. He had a real argument to be the best quarterback in the SEC. Him and Bryce Young were neck and neck. And I'm not going to say they were better playmakers, because Hendon Hooker, well, yeah, I am. Hendon Hooker had, quote-unquote, better playmakers, I guess you can say, around him. And that's just because Alabama's playmakers were so young. I mean, Alabama's wide receiving core was young. But anyway, Tennessee's losing Hendon Hooker. They're also losing big play wide receivers Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman. Big play wide receivers. Going to be a big loss for Tennessee. They're also losing linebacker Jeremy Banks, a very physical linebacker, and defensive lineman Byron Young, a very physical defensive lineman. But Tennessee, they're also returning 15 starters. Joe Milton, backup quarterback. I know he kind of did start. Started off and on. Played really good in the bowl game against Clemson. And then had spots during the season that he played really good. And they're also returning Bru McCoy. Returning Bru McCoy is huge for Tennessee, because that dude is a beast. He is. Bru McCoy is an absolute beast. So that is huge for Tennessee. And if we're being honest, and I ain't even got into the transfers yet, but just strictly off of what I saw from Tennessee against Clemson, that second string, or whatever you want to call them, Tennessee is going to be one to reckon with next year. No, they might not beat Georgia, but they're going to be one to reckon with. They're going to be a scary team next year. Some transfer portal additions for Tennessee. They got Oregon wide receiver Dante Thornton. Played a little bit for Oregon last year, but still going to be a big playmaker for Tennessee. Cornerback Gabe Judy Lowley out of BYU. Offensive tackle John Campbell. That's going to be a big one to kind of boost that offensive line. And then tight end McKellen Castles, which is huge. Tennessee in the tight end position. Tennessee also lost their offensive coordinator this year, Alex Galesh, because he went to take the head coaching job at USF. So that means they had to replace him during the offseason. And they did, but they did it within their program, just like Georgia did. All they did was promote quarterback coach Joey Hazel to offensive coordinator, which isn't a bad thing. He's already in there. He knows the system. And starting quarterback next year, they have that 5-star. It's like Nico Nico, I don't even know how to pronounce his last name. But he's supposed to be really good. But for being real, I expect Joe Milton to take the starting spot. He was when he was in for Tennessee last year, he was pretty legit. So I expect him to take the starting spot. Expectations for Tennessee, like I said, one to reckon with. I'm not going to say. I'm going to say Tennessee doesn't lose more than 2 games again. Yeah. Tennessee won't lose more than 2 games again. I don't even have to look at the schedule. Tennessee is going to be legit, especially if they bulking up that defense a little bit. That defense gets better, which I think it will. Watch out. But anyway, Team 3. South Carolina. South Carolina is coming off an 8-5 season. Shane Beamer entering his 3rd year as head coach. South Carolina kind of had an up and down season this year. Has some big wins over Tennessee and Clemson. But, I mean, they also had some ugly losses. I believe Missouri was one of them. I mean, like I said, up and down season for Tennessee. South Carolina lost 14 players to the portal. They're important players. They lost, I would say, Jaheim Bell, tight end. A real big one, Marshawn Lloyd, running back. He was the leading rusher for South Carolina last year. And then tight end Austin Stogner, which transferred to South Carolina last year, if I'm correct, from Oklahoma, along with Spencer Rattler. And I believe he's going back to Oklahoma after 1 year at South Carolina. So, missing those guys next year. But they've also gained 7. Most important, I would say tight end Trey Knox from Arkansas. That's big for South Carolina after losing Austin Stogner to Oklahoma. Kind of give them more depth, I guess. Spencer Rattler, he had an up and down season last year. He had 3,026 passing yards, 18 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. There's times last year where Spencer Rattler, if I'm just being straight up, there's times Spencer Rattler last year looked like the worst quarterback in the SEC. And then there's times last year where Spencer Rattler looked like a Heisman contender last year. There was. Spencer Rattler was so up and down last year. It wasn't even funny. But it's huge. Him returning is huge for South Carolina. South Carolina has got 7 players entering the draft. So that's 7 more players they're going to have to replace on top of the 14 that are in the portal, which, granted, all 14 are not starters. But, important players for South Carolina returning, like I said, Spencer Rattler, and then Anton Wells, wide receiver. He played a little bit last year. He'll have a bigger role this year, but him coming back is huge. South Carolina, they had to replace their offensive coordinator this offseason. Dowell Logans replaces Marcus Scatterfield. Scatterfield, he left to be the OC for Matt Rhule and Nebraska. So, expectations for South Carolina. I would say probably between 7-5, 8-4. I do expect them to build off the momentum for last year, but I don't expect them to win the East by any means or compete for the East, just because you have Georgia and Tennessee up there, 2 powerhouses. But I expect South Carolina to have a pretty good season. I would say somewhere around 8-4, 7-5, somewhere around in there. Next, you have Kentucky. Kentucky coming off a 7-6 season. Kentucky really had an up and down season. They really didn't have a signature win of any kind. Unless you want to count Florida or Louisville, the rivalry game, which I don't. So I would say Kentucky doesn't really have a signature win. Has some bad losses. I believe they lost to Vanderbilt. But Liam Cohen is expected to return as Kentucky's offensive coordinator for the second time. He was first there in 2021. When he was there in 2021, the offense was ranked 47th nationally. So he's set to return to Kentucky this year. Kentucky's picked up 8 transfers. The most important players, I would say, quarterback Devin Leary played really good for NC State last year before he got injured. He's going to be really good for Kentucky. If Kentucky has a good season, and by good season I mean 9-3, maybe 10-2, but I don't see 10-2. Devin Leary could be up for the Heisman. And people are probably going to laugh at me when I say that, but Devin Leary is going to be really good for Kentucky. He is. I have high expectations for Devin Leary. Then on top of that, you got Alabama offensive lineman Tanner Bowles. This is another big one. Vanderbilt running back Ray Davis. I expect him to be huge for Kentucky, considering Rich Rod, he can be gone to the draft. So I expect Ray Davis to step up and fill that void. Kentucky, they have 13 players entering the portal. Most important, I would say Justin Rogers and Kavosiey Smoke. Kavosiey Smoke, he didn't get much playing time last year, but when he did, he made it count. So, Kavosiey Smoke is a big player to lose there for Kentucky. But, like I said, Ray Davis can step into that slot, maybe fill the void of Smoke and Rich Rod at the same time. Kentucky have 10 players leaving for the NFL. Most important, I would say obviously Will Levis. Will Levis will probably go top 5 in the draft. So that's going to be huge for Kentucky. Losing running back Chris Rodriguez. Big running back for Kentucky last year. He's going to be hard to replace. Expectations for Kentucky next year. I would say probably about 8-4. I would have to look at the schedule, but I expect a pretty decent season from Kentucky next year. I'll say 7-5, 8-4, maybe 9-3. If they can pull a shocker somewhere, but yeah, I say that's doable. Next, we got Florida. Florida, 6-7 last year. Billy Napier's second season at Florida this coming up season. Billy Napier's first season, Florida did have that big win over Utah. 29-26. They did have that ugly loss to Vandy. 31-24. Florida, they picked up 10 players from the portal. Most notably, I would say quarterback Graham Mertz is a big one for Florida. Especially them losing Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson was a big playmaker. So, being able to bring in Graham Mertz is huge. He has a strong arm. He has pretty good mobility. Nowhere near Anthony Richardson. But he has pretty good mobility. So, I feel like Graham Mertz can step in and fill that void. Also, they got Alabama tackle Damian George. Louisville defensive lineman Caleb Banks. Michigan linebacker Deuce Spurlock. I believe that's going to be a big one. I believe he might pretty big contributor for Florida next year. I feel like he could be. And then running back from Tulane, Cameron Carroll. But Florida, they've also lost 23 players to the portal. 23 players. I would say some of the big ones would be on the offensive line. Guard Ethan White. And then probably tackle Michael Tarquin. He is committed to USC. And losing Tarquin, that's a big one. Because when you lose Tarquin, now you're worried about depth at the wide receiver, at the tackle position, excuse me. Because now they're going to be low in depth at the tackle position. But Billy Napier, he should be able to recruit, maybe get some transfers in there, fill that slot. Florida has 10 players leaving for the NFL. Most notably, obviously, Anthony Richardson. He times last year. I guess you could compare him to Spencer Rattler. Times last year looked like one of the best players in the SEC. Also, times last year looked like one of the worst players in the SEC. But made big plays for Florida, helped them win ball games. He's going to be a big one to replace. Safety Trey Dean, he's going to be a big one. Wide receiver Justin Shorter, another big one. Guard Osiris Torrance, he's going to be big. He's a big physical O-lineman. He's going to be hard to replace. And then Brenton Cox, I put him on here just because, he is a big name and a big loss for Florida, if you ask me. But he didn't even finish the season last year for Florida. He got kicked off the team in October. So then you have those leaving for the NFL. Going back to Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson, he was very inconsistent for Florida last year. If he would have had more consistency, my bad. They would have won more games. He was very up and down last year. But anyway, Florida is replacing their defensive coordinator from last year, Patrick Toney. And they're replacing Patrick Toney with Austin Armstrong. For those of you who don't know, Toney left to be the defensive coordinator for the Arizona Cardinals. And then Florida hired Armstrong to be their DC. Hired Armstrong. He was originally at Southern Miss. He was the defensive coordinator at Southern Miss. And when he was at Southern Miss, he had a top 50 scoring defense in the country. So that should tell you something if you're a Florida fan. Armstrong was most recently hired at Alabama to be the inside linebackers coach this coming up season, but obviously didn't stay there long. I think it's probably not even a month, and took the job of Florida. So, expectations for Florida this coming up year, I don't expect much of a drop off at quarterback, honestly, because I think Graham Mertz is a good quarterback. I want to see more. I want to see a little bit more from the offensive line. The defense was okay. I want to say maybe 6-6. 6-6. I think he gets to a bowl game. But anyway, got 2 more teams, and these next 2 I have stars on because they're big ones in my eyes. And these last 2, you can probably guess if you've been keeping up with who we have and have not done. This next one is Missouri. Missouri went 6-7 last year. Got Eli Drinkwitz entering his 4th year. Eli Drinkwitz, in 3 years, he is 17-19 as a head coach. So a losing record, 3 seasons. This year, during his 6-7 season, 4 of those 7 losses last year, and this is where it really doesn't seem as bad as it looks for Missouri. Because 4 of those 7 losses last year, Auburn, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky. Lost to all 4 of them last year by a combined 18 points. Missouri was Georgia's closest game last year. I think that game ended up being like 18-12 or something like that. I can't remember, but that was Georgia's closest game last year. I think they had the lead until the 4th quarter. Missouri, I think, is this close. I think they're this close. Because Eli Drinkwitz, he's a good offensive mind and a good play caller. I guess you could say he's got to get the right assistants. But I expect more out of Missouri this year. there have been rumors on firing Eli Drinkwitz. Me personally, they gave him an extension, a 2-year extension, raised the salary up to $6 million in 2023, and then $7 million in 2027. And the extension is through the 2027 season. I don't see a reason to fire him just yet. But, Missouri hasn't won a bowl game since 2014 when they won the Citrus Bowl. They lost in the Gasparilla Bowl to Wake Forest 27-17. But I will say this is a quote-unquote prove-it year, in my opinion, for Eli Drinkwitz. I believe if he does not do anything this year, then I believe next year you really consider a change in some form or fashion. But if I would give him this year, Missouri, they got a new offensive coordinator this year. They hired Kirby Moore out of Fresno State. Before they hired Moore out of Fresno State, Drinkwitz was calling the plays. And this goes back to what I was saying when I would say give Drinkwitz one more year and let him get the right guys. I not saying he's not a good play caller. He is. But I don't think that's what Eli Drinkwitz needs to be doing. He needs to be focused on his head coaching duties. That's why I think hiring Kirby Moore was a good idea. Let them learn a new system under him. And let Eli Drinkwitz focus on being a head coach. In 3 seasons, Moore's offense at Fresno State, when he was at Fresno State as the OC, led the Mountain West. He led the Mountain West in total offense, scoring 402 points, or had 402.6 yards per game, And then also led the Mountain West in points per game, scoring 30.6. So obviously big numbers there. Again, they have 8 returning starters, and then they also have 77% of their offensive production returning. On the offensive side, most notably Brady Cook. Obviously, it's going to be big coming back from Missouri. Wide receiver Luther Burden and wide receiver Mookie Cooper. 2 big play wide receivers that you need to watch this season for Missouri. they're going to be a big help for Missouri if they're going to push that 6-7 win column. Defensive starters, they have 8. Most notably, I would probably say linebacker Tyron Hopper. And one of the players entering the draft for Missouri this year, I kind of want to talk about him alone. Him and him only. Because it's a kicker, and you normally don't talk about kickers that often. But Missouri's kicker, Harrison Mevis. For those of you who don't know Harrison Mevis, you need to go look him up. Because he was one of the best kickers in the SEC last year. I mean, and this wasn't no ordinary kicker. This dude weighed 250 plus pounds. You don't see a kicker that weighs 250 plus pounds. And just listen to these stats for a minute. Harrison Mevis. Okay? He was 22 for 28 on field goals made all year. And the further he got, usually it's the closer they are, the better. No, the further he got, the better he got. He was 7 for 7 from 40 plus yards. And then he was 4 for 6 from 50 plus. That's ridiculous. So whoever drafts him is drafting an absolute beast. And then, of course, they're losing defensive lineman Isaiah McGuire and defensive lineman DJ Coleman. See, Missouri lost 11 players in the portal. Say, most important, talked about earlier, Georgia getting Dominic Lovett. I would say offensive tackle Hiron White. And defensive end Trayvon Ford are 3 big names leaving Missouri for me. But he also gained 9 to the portal. I would say most notably, quarterback Jake Garcia out of Miami. So you got a little quarterback competition there going between Garcia and Cook. Got wide receiver Theo Wease. Came from Oklahoma. Defensive back Trevez Johnson out of Florida. And defensive lineman Austin Firestone out of Northwestern. All those guys I expect to be big play contributors maybe in some way. I believe you are going to have a quarterback competition between Jake Garcia and Brady Cook. You might see Brady Cook start off the season strictly off of experience, which Garcia, he didn't play bad for Miami last year, but I expect Cook to start the season, but I wouldn't be surprised if Garcia moved into that role as the season progressed. Expectations for Missouri, I would say I expect the offense to improve. Defense was already pretty good. I mean, it didn't start off the season good, but the defense really improved as the season went on, and it got pretty good. And they returned most of their defensive unit from last year, so I expect the defense to be pretty good. Like I said, offense going to be better. I feel like I would say seven wins. Maybe 6. 6 or 7. Alright. Last one. This is a big one. Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt got Clark Lea entering his 3rd season. Clark Lea. Now, he's only 7-17 in 2 seasons of Vandy. And he went 5-7 last year. But he beat Northern Illinois 38-28. Beat Kentucky 24-21, which snapped a 26-game SEC losing streak. And then turn around and beat Florida 31-24, and that Kentucky and Florida, those 2 games back-to-back. So he has 2 back-to-back SEC wins in his 2nd season. Then on top of that, they played Bama this past year. And the final score to that game, 55-3. That score might have seemed lopsided, but those of you who watched that game, that they fought Alabama hard. They did. And I know some people might call me crazy, but they did. They scratched and clawed. So, but anyway, Vanderbilt last season signed one of the best recruiting classes in Vanderbilt history. Vanderbilt has one portal arrival, and that is linebacker Aeneas DeCosmo. I apologize if I murdered your name. And a big one for Vandy, and this hits hard for Vandy, is they have 12 players entering the portal. And some big names, too. Mike Wright, quarterback, he's transferring to Mississippi State. Running back Ray Davis, like I mentioned earlier, going to Kentucky. Defensive end Elijah McAllister is going to Auburn. So, some big names entering the portal there for Vandy, which is going to hit them a little bit. but I don't think it's gonna hit them too much. I mean, if you're Vandy, if you lose talent anytime at Vandy, that's not a good sign, because at Vanderbilt you don't have much depth. But they are, like I mentioned earlier, they are losing Mike Wright, but behind Mike Wright, they do have AJ Swan. And AJ Swan actually replaced Mike White during the season. And during his time as starting quarterback, he led Vandy to wins over Northern Illinois, where they were down 28-14, and they came back and won 38-28. And during that game, he went 17 for 25, 244 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And then, later in the season, Wright took his job back when Swan got injured against South Carolina. But the Vanderbilt's got 2 players going to the draft. Cornerback Jeremy Lewson and safety Anthony Orji. They've got the 52nd recruiting class so far. I know I have not mentioned that on any other, but I felt like that was important to list for Vandy. But Vanderbilt, they surprised me last year. I was not expecting last year for Vandy to get 5 wins. I was barely expecting 3 wins, much less 5. And they were this close to becoming bowl eligible. This close. And not to mention that some of those losses for Vandy were about like 3 points, 36 points. So, but on to this year. I expect Vandy, I'm going to say, have a little bit of a drop off. Because, just because of the talent, they're losing to the portal. Like I said, also losing Mike Wright, Ray Davis. I would say 3, 4 wins. No, I'd give them 4. I'd give them 4 because their non-conference is not bad. I say that lightly because it's Vandy. But their non-conference is not that bad. So I give them 4 wins. But so that is the SEC East. Join me next week for the West, and I will break down the West. If you have any questions, drop it down in the comments. If you have any suggestions, if you want me to break down any schedules, drop that in the comments and drop whose schedule you want me to break down. Um, let give me some feedback. Let me know how I did, whether it's good or bad. And I believe that's it. I will see y'all next week. Thank y'all.